The CNN studio lights blazed hot and unforgiving as Senator Tim Scott leaned forward, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had just delivered what he clearly believed was a knockout, punch-polished, rehearsed, and designed to put Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in her place. She didn't flinch. Crockett, 32, sat poised and unshaken. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable, but there was something sharp behind her eyes. Scott didn't recognize it. He thought he was staring down a political rookie. What he didn't realize was that he had just triggered a response that would not only flip the entire panel dynamic, but turn him into a cautionary tale. Congresswoman Crockett embodies everything wrong with today's Democratic Party, Scott announced with performative ease. She's young, inexperienced, and frankly out of her depth when it comes to serious issues. The words had barely landed before the temperature in the room shifted. In the next 60 seconds, Senator Tim Scott would go from confidently condescending to visibly rattled. Jasmine Crockett's rebuttal wouldn't just be sharp, it would be a scalpel to his entire political persona. By the time she was done, Scott would be staring down at his notes, speechless, while clips of the exchange rocketed across every platform on the internet. What began as a routine debate was about to shatter every expectation. Scott entered the studio with the self-assurance of a veteran lawmaker who'd spent over a decade curating his image. At 58, the South Carolina senator was one of the GOP's most prominent black figures. Lauded for his calm demeanor and polished talking points. His nickname, the gentleman from South Carolina, had protected him from many things but not from what was coming. Across the studio, the freshman Democrat wasn't posturing. She was preparing gum, measured, lethal. In her first term in Congress, Crockett had already proven herself a force. While many underestimated her as just another young progressive, she had quietly built a reputation for surgical precision in both policy and rhetoric. A former civil rights attorney with a record of courtroom wins and a fearless approach to power, she hadn't entered politics to blend in. She came to challenge anyone who thought her age, race, or gender meant she didn't belong. Crockett had done her homework. She knew Scott's voting history. She had studied his statements. So when he launched into his well-worn script about fiscal responsibility, she didn't interrupt. She let him talk. Then she struck with the calm authority of someone who had seen real injustice and fought it. Crockett began citing specific infrastructure, failures in Texas' structurally unsound bridges, failing water systems from the 1960s, economic studies showing the human cost of underfunding. She wasn't rambling, she was building something. Scott tried to cut in his second mistake. "Senator," she said coolly, "I understand the appeal of slogans over substance, but where I come from, broken infrastructure isn't theoretical, it's deadly." The studio went quiet. Even Anderson Cooper, the seasoned CNN anchor, leaned forward slightly. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a reckoning. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't resort to theatrics. She simply dismantled every assumption Scott had walked in with about her, about the new Democratic Party, and about who gets to claim authority in Washington. The clip of her response would be watched tens of millions of times within hours. Tim Scott had walked into the studio expecting to dominate a discussion on policy. What he walked into was a generational confrontation, one where the old guard miscalculated the new UN. By the time it was over, America had witnessed the political equivalent of a mic drop. "Well, Anderson," Senator Tim Scott began, flashing a condescending smile, "it's refreshing to hear a young member so passionate about these issues. But passion isn't the same as understanding how Congress actually works." The air in the studio thickened instantly. Anderson Cooper's brows lifted ever so slightly, a subtle signal that he recognized what had just happened. A line had been crossed, and someone had just wandered into dangerous territory. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. But if you were watching closely, you might have caught the slightest flicker in her expression. The tightening of her jaw, the shift in her posture. Then she struck. "Senator Scott," she said evenly, "I appreciate your concern about my understanding of Congress. Perhaps you can help me and our viewers understand how your experience led you to vote against an infrastructure bill that would have brought $15 billion in improvements to your own state. Scott's smile wavered just briefly, but long enough to register. He regrouped quickly, slipping back into polished political mode. Congresswoman, with all due respect, you've been in office less than 2 years. I've been fighting for South Carolina for over a decade. Sometimes experience teaches you that good intentions don't always make good policy. The tone was unmistakable, dripping with paternalistic contempt. Behind the cameras, members of the studio crew exchanged glances. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was about to become a defining moment. Crockett leaned forward slightly, never raising her voice. You're absolutely right, Senator. Experience matters. So, let's talk about yours. Her delivery was cool, methodical. In your decade plus in Congress, can you name 3 major pieces of legislation you've authored, not co-sponsored, that became law and directly improved lives in South Carolina? Scott blinked. The question hung in the air like a trap. And it was, because everyone in that studio, including Anderson Cooper, knew the answer. Scott cleared his throat. Well, I've been involved in numerous. I didn't ask what you've been involved in, Crockett interrupted, still calm, still smiling. I asked what you've authored. It's a simple question. Senator, surely a man with your experience has 3 clear examples. The silence in the room deepened. Scott's frustration started to bubble. This wasn't how the exchange was supposed to go. And what he did next only made it worse. He turned away from her. Anderson, this is exactly what I'm talking about, he said, addressing the anchor instead of Crockett. A new generation of Democrats thinks attacking Republicans is the same as governing. Congresswoman Crockett represents everything wrong with the new Democratic Party: young, inexperienced, and clearly out of her depth. The insult didn't just hang in the air, it stung. And he hadn't even looked her in the eye when he said it. In the control room, producers knew they had just captured something explosive. Phones started lighting up. Cooper leaned back in his chair slightly the way he did when he sensed political self-destruction in real time. Crockett didn't move for a beat. She let the insult echo through the silence. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter than before, not because she was shaken, but because she wanted every word to hit. Senator Scott, she began softly. Just so I'm clear, you believe I'm too young and inexperienced to contribute to serious political discussion. Is that correct? Scott hesitated, then doubled down. I believe the American people deserve leaders who understand governing, not just how to craft sound bites. Crockett nodded once. And that wisdom comes from your extensive legislative record. The trap was locked. The whole room felt it. Scott was stuck. Either admit his record was thin, or pretend his experience was more substantive than it was. I've been a consistent conservative voice for my state. Consistent, yes, Crockett interjected. Consistently voting against infrastructure, against expanded healthcare access, against economic development. But since we're talking about experience, let's go there. She reached into a folder beside her and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The camera zoomed in instinctively. Everyone in television knows when a politician brings receipts, something is about to explode. I have your voting record from the past 5 years. She held the page up. Would you like me to read it, or would you prefer to explain to the viewers why someone with your level of experience voted against veteran healthcare funding 4 times, infrastructure bills 6 times, and disaster relief for your own constituents twice? You could hear a pin drop. Scott's face paled. The smirk was gone. He realized too late that this wasn't a debate. It was an ambush, and he had walked into it blind. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Not even close. She leaned back again, confident and collected. Men like you underestimate me because I'm young. You dismiss me because I'm a woman. And you condescend because you think your position gives you the right to define what black leadership should look like. She opened her folder once more and held up a second document. And just so we're clear, I came prepared. She waved the page slightly. This is your campaign finance report from last year. Everyone in the room knew what was coming next. They also knew there would be no recovering from it. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won the argument, she'd rewritten the playbook. Want to explain? To the voters, Crockett began, voice steady and eyes locked on Scott. Why 78% of your campaign contributions came from out-of state donors, while you consistently vote against legislation that would help South Carolina residents. Scott blinked. It hit like a gut punch. The image he'd spent years cultivating, the loyal servant of his home state, started unraveling on livetelevision.org. Crockett continued, would you rather discuss your attendance record at committee meetings that directly impact black communities? Because I have those numbers. She slid the documents aside and leaned in slightly. Her voice dropped, not louder, but sharper, the kind of quiet that makes an entire studio hold its breath. Senator, you said, I represent everything wrong with a new Democratic Party. Let me tell you what I actually represent. Pause. Then a precision. Strike. I represent what happens when you underestimate a black woman who's smarter than you, more prepared than you, and who's not intimidated by your title or your condescending attitude. The camera cut in tight. Scott stared at the table, not a glance up. Crockett didn't move. She didn't need to. She'd already taken control. I represent the future of American politics, she said, her voice calm and clipped. Politicians who do their homework, who fight for their constituents, and who won't be lectured by people who confuse longevity with effectiveness. Then she turned, looked directly into the camera, and spoke to every young person watching who'd been told they were too young, too inexperienced, or not qualified enough. This is what preparation looks like. This is what happens when you know your facts, understand your opponent's weaknesses, and refuse to be intimidated. Silence. No crosstalk, no spin, just the quiet hum of the studio lights. Scott sat frozen, still avoiding eye contact. The studio didn't feel like a debate stage anymore. It felt like a courtroom, and he was on the receiving end of closing arguments he wasn't ready for. Anderson Cooper looked stunned. A seasoned journalist who'd seen it all. Even he took a beat. We're going to take a quick break, he finally said, his voice just barely covering the astonishment on his face. And when we come back, well, I'm not sure what we'll talk about, because I think Congresswoman Crockett just said everything that needed to be said. They cut to commercial, but it was too late. The internet had already exploded, within minutes. The clip of Crockett's takedown was everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, political blogs, Reddit threads, news tickers. It spread like fire across a dry field. Crockett destroys, Scott trended. Number 1, within 30 minutes. Screenshots of Scott's downcast stare became an instant meme. Split-screen images showed him smiling at the debate start next to his crushed expression by the end. The caption, how it started versus how it ended. One tweet read, Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in how to eviscerate a man with facts and grace. Surgical. It was retweeted over 50,000 times in the first hour. Another viral post read, Tim Scott thought he was debating a freshman. He forgot she was a civil rights attorney with a flawless memory and every receipt on hand. That one cracked 75,000 retweets before midnight. The most viral image, Crockett calmly setting down her documents with the caption, when they call you inexperienced, but you brought homework, flashcards, and extra credit. Over 200,000 shares. Even elected officials jumped in. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, this is what happens when you underestimate a brilliant black woman who came prepared. Absolute clinic from Jasmine Crockett. Senator Elizabeth Warren posted, preparation met opportunity, and Crockett owned that momentum masterclass in political courage. Even GOP strategist Rick Wilson grudgingly admitted, don't agree with her on policy, but that was brutal. Crockett ran circles around Scott. The RNC tried damage control. Senator Scott has a proven record of conservative leadership, they posted. The replies were merciless. Proven record of voting against his own state's interests. One said, he couldn't even lead that conversation. Did you watch the same clip we did? Right-wing pundits tried to spin, but there was video unedited, relentless, and undeniable. Scott had come into the studio armed with talking points. Crockett came with proof. Tucker Carlson called it another case of liberal media bias. But something unusual happened. His own viewers weren't buying it. One Fox viewer comment cut through the noise. "I'm conservative, but Scott got destroyed fair and square. She had facts, he had attitude. Facts won. Fact-checkers pounced not out of bias, but out of necessity." Every claim Crockett made was dissected, verified, and confirmed. The Washington Post dropped a deep dive titled "Crockett's Claims." A fact-check of her Scott takedown. It was damning. She hadn't exaggerated a single number. His infrastructure votes. As she said, his record on veterans' healthcare, confirmed. His campaign donors and legislative authorship. Verifiable. Line by line, CNN's Daniel Dale published his analysis within hours. We found no factual errors in Congresswoman Crockett's statements. Senator Scott's voting record aligns precisely with her descriptions. It wasn't just a mic drop. It was a case study in how preparation dismantles bluster, and it didn't stop there. Political science professors across the country began assigning the clip as homework. Georgetown's Sarah Chen told her students, "This is what happens when you weaponize facts. Study it." Staffers in DC started passing the video around like a training manual. The phrase echoed in Democratic offices. This is how you handle condescension? But the biggest impact. Young black women, law students, interns, new staffers. Social media lit up with personal reactions. Watching Jasmine Crockett tonight made me realize, I don't have to accept being talked down to. I'm in law school. I'm studying this like it's a Supreme Court argument. She showed us all what it means to show up overprepared and unafraid. Scott's office tried to shrug it off with a generic press release. Senator Scott stands by his record of conservative leadership. But when reporters asked for rebuttals or specifics, they got deflection. Not one fact Crockett cited could be disproven. So they pivoted to calling it partisan theater. Scott himself stayed silent for 2 days, an eternity in political time. When he finally surfaced on a conservative radio show, his defense fell flat. "Sometimes things get taken out of context," he said. The host pushed back. "But were her facts about your record wrong?" Scott hesitated. "Well, voting records can be complicated." The reply, "That's not an answer, Senator." Even in a friendly space, there was nowhere to hide from the truth she laid bare. Within a week, the fallout was measurable. Crockett's approval among Democrats skyrocketed, up 23 points. Her national name recognition surged by 40%. Scott's approval in South Carolina dropped 8 points. Among black voters, the damage was sharper, 15-point decline. But the impact went deeper than polling. Newsrooms began updating their formats, embedding real-time fact checks in debates. The Crockett Standard became shorthand for coming armed with receipts. Democratic strategists looked to recruit more candidates with courtroom experience. Republicans started rewriting prep notes. Never underestimate based on age or resume. Always prepare for documentation. Then it crossed into culture. Stephen Colbert ran a full segment titled "How to Get Schooled by Someone Half Your Age." SNL aired a debate skit where every argument ended with, "Actually, I have your voting record right here." Pulling a Crockett entered the political dictionary, meaning to destroy an opponent with cold, verified data. It wasn't a viral moment. It was a movement. Beyond the drama and political fallout, the moment exposed a deeper truth about the state of American politics, that preparation now matters more than pedigree. That substance can still outshine style. And that social media doesn't just reflect political discourse, it reshapes it in real time. Political scientists dissected the clip. Not for its entertainment value, but as a case study in shifting power dynamics. The old order respecting seniority, just because it existed, was being replaced. At least, when the cameras were rolling, merit was finally getting its moment. 6 months later, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a trending name. She was being talked about as a national figure. She was headlining events at Ivy League schools, think tanks, political summits. Her follower count exploded by 300%. And with it came a voice that extended far beyond Texas. She wasn't just a local representative anymore. She was a movement. Tim Scott, meanwhile, found himself shrinking. Not officially, he still held office, still gave speeches, but something had shifted. His colleagues avoided sparring with prepared Democrats. No one wanted to be the next viral casualty, and within Republican leadership, Scott's instincts were now being second-guessed. He had overplayed his hand. He underestimated the wrong person. The Crockett-Scott moment entered classrooms from law schools to communications programs. Required viewing, students were taught its key lessons.